Three very disturbing true military war horror stories. This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. I won't mention the name of the base, but I'm sure that there are many people out there who will know which one it is once I make mention of some of the details to this story. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived at this base in 2006, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long, and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that the little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working, but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turned off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot at the base this night. Keep in mind that I've been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point, the storage area had been completely closed down except for a few minor areas which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks of this area. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Alpha Kit partner had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, a cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So come about 4 o'clock in the morning, we decided to do our last check, seeing as all the main maintenance guys had went home for the night. In this area, the only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We piled in, locked the gates behind us, and continued on our way. My Alpha was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area, which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine, and we had finished our rounds. My Alpha makes the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting the breeze, when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio playing seemed to become less audible as we approached the structure from my previous story. And I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear. But as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite of the structure, and out of my left ear, I heard a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. A faint creepy moan begins to ring inside the cab of the truck between the two of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I feel my blood turn cold, and I quickly turn to my Alpha and yell, "Dude, cut that out." My Alpha turns to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he begins to take his foot off the accelerator and asks, "Am I going too fast?" I remain silent for a moment with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listen. I hear the noise again. My partner interrupts and asks, "What's wrong?" I quickly turn the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whisper to him, "Do you hear that?" He stops the truck in confusion and listens closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two when we both hear it, this time. That long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again. What the hell is that? We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck are easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal on metal clatter, and the diesel engine has that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time. That groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, my alpha puts the truck in drive and he hauls our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street in that entire base. He nearly flips the truck going around a curve, but it doesn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. My alpha watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of it or that we had just imagined the entire thing being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to the both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice. Once in that same place and the other in that building behind you, as he points at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliche with that grudge-like moan we had heard, but it honestly happened and it still brings those tears of fright to my eyes every time I tell it. I went back to that storage area only once after that, but I never went down that road again and I never went after dark. I haven't told my story to many people except for my wife and a few other of my close friends. I haven't forgotten it to this day. I was a young recruit, freshly drafted out of high school, and I didn't know much about the war. I had no idea what I was getting into or what it was all for. But what I did know was that I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. We arrived on a Friday evening and got loaded onto many buses to be taken to our barracks. The air was very humid, and the soil was soaking wet due to a storm that had just passed through the area. I vividly remember the drive and how it stunk like a sewer. My first night was uneventful and quiet, but we all felt the tense atmosphere as our drill surgeons taunted us with stories during basic training. I remember the half moon right over my head, which kept peeking out from over the clouds, and all of us were just sitting around telling jokes. I was more of a technical guy and didn't have much aptitude for comedy, so I just listened. And my duty was to manage communications between my unit and all of our other guys so that everyone knew what was going on everywhere else. I carried a box on my back, which was the size of radio devices back then, and also a ton more equipment and supplies. I was quickly assigned to a tight-knit unit who had just lost their communications operator to a landmine, and I remember the first time we made contact with the enemy. It was the loudest thing I ever heard. We were in a dense part of the jungle and couldn't see the enemy at all, but we quickly ducked as soon as they began firing at us, and we opened fire in their general direction in return. The chaos seemed to last forever, and we probably ceased fire after a couple of minutes. We advanced forward to close in on the enemy and secure the area, and it was the first time I ever saw the enemy up close. There they were, 3 dead Viet Cong soldiers laying in a pool of their own blood. I couldn't believe that I was looking at 3 human beings that were alive just moments ago, young guys who maybe had sisters or brothers and parents. They were probably just chilling around moments before we arrived, and here we are moments later looking at their motionless bodies. But I must say that I felt justified because they were the enemy, and they would have been standing over our dead bodies instead. A few days later, we got assigned to a different location which saw heavier casualties and needed more support. I grew accustomed to the violence and saw many of our young men die painfully. One day, I was told by my NCO that someone wanted to speak with me. I was greeted by an older man in his late 50s who looked totally out of place. His demeanor was calculated and predictive, and even my commanding officer seemed to have turned into a yes man in front of him. He introduced himself as Rick Douglas, an intelligence officer stationed nearby, and I was going to be assigned to him as an RTO for his unit. I liked my unit and wanted to stay with them, but orders are orders and I had no choice. So I got in the Huey and went with him. We landed in a heavily wooded area next to a few Viet Cong huts. It was heavily built up by the enemy, and I could definitely imagine the fight that must have taken place here. There were some guys who had gas masks on and others standing nearby, but they didn't seem to notice me or even care that I was there. It was a very strange atmosphere that didn't feel quite right. These guys didn't act like normal soldiers and definitely didn't have the look of fear in their eyes as most of us did. I even tried to talk with some of them, but all I got was a strange, emotionless glare, like they were infected with something. Whatever it was, they all had it, and it made me feel very uneasy. Officer Douglas and I entered one of the smaller huts, and I was told to stay put until someone would come and get me. I should have just stayed there and waited, but I was too curious and apprehensive to relax, so I just made my way out towards the main tent and took a peek inside. What I saw made my stomach drop like it never had before. On a makeshift table lay 6 murky containers. Each one of them had a severed head of a guerrilla fighter inside with several tubes and wires protruded from them. A green liquid seemed to be reacting with the heads as their mouths and eyes were quivering like they were half alive. I suddenly felt a hand grab onto my shoulder. It was Intelligence Officer Douglas, and he looked very upset. I meekly asked what they were doing inside there. He angrily said that I should not have gone in there and sent me back to my hut. We must have been attacked or something because I woke up a day later in Trige with several broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, with no memory of anything that happened. Right after that, I never saw Officer Frederick Douglass or those soldiers ever again during my time, if that was even his real name. And I often wonder what those guys were doing back there. Maybe they were trying to gather intelligence from dead enemy soldiers or something. Either way, it was a strange experience that I'll never forget. All names in the story will be changed and all locations will be left out. Did you like it? Tell us what you think of the video in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting videos.